Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Disaster Recovery Readiness. Are you really protected? This event is brought to you in partnership with Quest and produced by Actual Tech Media. Thanks so much for joining the webinar today. We've got a great topic and a great discussion lined up for you. Before we get started, there's just a few things that you should know about the event. First off, my name is David Davis of Actual Tech Media, and I'll be serving as the moderator. As always, here at Actual Tech Media, we're all former IT professionals ourselves. We know how tough it can be in the world of enterprise IT, and we are here to help solve your challenges. Today, of course, it's especially around disaster recovery, a hot topic for all of us in the world of IT. We welcome your hello and good morning and good afternoon messages from across the United States and around the world there in the questions box. But we also want your technical questions on today's topic. We even have a best question prize, which I'll be talking about later in the event here to help encourage your questions on today's topic. We also have a number of resources there in the handouts tab I want to call your attention to. There are two PDFs that you can download, one on enhancing your disaster recovery strategy with Core Store, and another on the NetVault Plus Enterprise Data Protection, Backup Acceleration, and Deduplication Solution. These are solutions that you'll learn about on today's webinar, but I encourage you to go ahead and just download those resources now to make sure that you have them available and you can read them after the event. And then finally, at the end of the webinar, I'll be announcing the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card door prize. If you're watching this on demand, of course, that drawing would have already occurred. The prize terms and conditions can be found there in the handouts tab as well. And now, before I introduce you to today's expert presenter, I want to first talk for just a moment about the state of disaster preparedness in 2021 to set the stage for today's topic. With the real question being here, are you really protected? How do you really know? And so, let's first take just the state of disasters here in the United States. I mean, you might think that, disasters never going to hit me. You might think that your company is, somewhat immune, a little special, maybe from these large scale disasters that might happen on the other side of the North American continent, right? Based on the large but few disasters that are covered on the evening news, you might assume they always happen to someone else. But actually, if you go to the US Federal Emergency Management Agency website, it's pretty cool. You can actually get a list of all the declared disasters by year over time, and you can filter those and you can see exactly how many have occurred this year and what type they are. And in fact, there are 96 declared disasters so far this year, talking about floods, fires, hurricanes, tornadoes, and more. And with 2021 being roughly only 75% complete at this point, we already have 96 declared disasters, and that's just in the United States. And these are just declared disasters. So, if you don't believe that, you can also, look at a number of other resources out there just to try to help convince yourself, or maybe it's the executives at your company that, we're not immune from disaster and we need to be prepared. Another resource I found was, interestingly enough, on Wikipedia. There is a list of actually 16 different pages in an index just dedicated to disasters of all different types that have occurred in the United States just in 2021. So this isn't like going back through history. This is just in 2021. There's 16 different pages dedicated to the list of, blizzards, tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, and more. Just again in the U.S. And those, might be all major disasters. And you might think, well, we're not going to get hit with a major disaster, but think about the localized disasters that could happen. And in fact, those localized disasters happen much more frequently than these types of major disasters. I mean, you might be hit with, regional flooding, perhaps a tropical storm, or perhaps, maybe a water pipe breaks in the data center. You won't be as happy as this guy appears to be here in the graphic, but a water pipe from, for example, a sprinkler system or a plumbing, you know, a plumbing system, being backed up or a pipe breaking can really flood out a data center and cause some massive disasters. Another example of a localized disaster is, for example, even just a electrical short or a small fire. These can still cause major outages, in your data center. And that's not going to make the evening news, but it sure is going to perhaps, ruin your weekend and your employees' productivity, for the day. And then when we put our data inside the public cloud, too many of us assume that it's protected, but you can't count on hosted data being protected. You have to have your own disaster recovery plan for it, because you look at massive outages, even like the massive fire that destroyed the tier 3 OVH data center in Strasbourg earlier this year. Too many companies out there assumed that just because their data was in the cloud that it was protected, and we know that that's not the case. We're constantly dealing with ever growing, never ending, ceaseless data growth. The worldwide amount of data expected to be by 2024 is 149 zettabytes. Just some incredible, numbers out there. And of course, we have even more and more distributed data. We have data in the cloud. We have SaaS apps. We have data on our mobile devices, our desktops, and oh yeah, I guess we also have it in the data center, right? We have to protect our data, wherever it might be. And of course, the cost of downtime, in the data center is ever growing. As our companies' profits and revenue grows over time, the potential cost of even just an hour of downtime, as you can see here, this is in millions of dollars. For example, across media and communications or banking and finance, $9 million per hour. That's just one estimate. And of course, it's going to range from company to company. And we're not immune, of course, from ransomware. That's kind of the topic of the day. Ransomware attacks in the enterprise. One statistic says they're up 500% this year, and this will cost businesses $11.5 billion. So, of course, we have to protect ourselves from ransomware and be able to rapidly recover should we get hit. But we don't want to forget about natural disasters, user-caused disasters of some kind, perhaps a accidental massive data deletion. These are the types of things that happen much more common than, for example, a large natural disaster. And the question really is, can you confidently recover if you have a disaster? Can you fully recover your critical systems with the current strategies and the technology that you have in place? And one statistic from Forrester showed that only 28% of businesses said that they could recover. And the flip side of that is 72% of businesses said that they could not recover. They didn't feel confident that they could recover their critical data in a timely period. And so that's why today's topic is just so critical. And we're going to learn a lot from our expert here at Quest. And with that, I'm excited now to introduce you to Mr. Adrian Moir, technology strategist in the CTO office at Quest. Adrian, it's great to have you on.
Great to be here, David.
Absolutely, yeah. So tell us about your 7-step plan to help ensure that we are ready for disaster.
Well, these are 7 steps that anybody could kind of sit down and implement. They're kind of straightforward elements that enable you to kind of think about the wider aspects of this kind of subject. And if you've got to think about natural disasters, whether you've got to think about flood and fire and all of those things, those are kind of the big things that happen. But if you look at kind of disasters in the smaller scale, what constitutes a disaster for you? That's the key thing here. Is it, is it a major natural disaster, or is it because you've just had, an issue in your data center that's taken out more than you thought it would ever do? So it could be something relatively small or something very, very large. But understanding what you've got to do to mitigate against that is kind of key. And this is all about the disaster recovery piece. It's 2 words. You have a disaster, you need to recover from that. So you kind of have to work out a methodology to make sure that what you do have in place, if you have anything at all, that is, can actually be used. And that's something that a lot of people tend to do. Say, yeah, I've got a disaster recovery plan, and they never test it. So these steps that we can go through, I've got 7 kind of primary steps that you can get through to actually think about ways of implementing, thinking about the thoughts you might want to put into, thinking about how you set things up going forward. So these kind of 7-step plans, they're very, very simple. And I've also been at the end of kind of data center disasters as well in my past. I've had rain coming into a data center, standing there with rain coming on your head. That's kind of interesting. And I've seen companies put data centers in basements. They think it's a really good idea. It's unused space. They have the basement all sealed up, something they call tanking, so that it shouldn't let water in. That's great until the main water, the water main bursts right next to the building. There is no amount of tanking that is going to stop that level of water coming in, and it didn't in that case. And you consider all the nice things that are sitting at the bottom of your data center cabinets. What do we put at the bottom? Usually all the UPSs that are sat down there, all full of lovely battery acid, which then leaks out and gently etches away at the paint on your nice shiny cabinets. So even think about where you've got things located. I've seen people put them behind kitchens where there's potential water. I've seen people with air conditioning systems right over the top of the cabinets, and of course they have a habit of leaking too. So sometimes it's just the simple things that you kind of have to think about. But I think what we'll do with this, as you kind of led into that 96 kind of natural disasters just across the United States, let's think about the bigger pictures. Let's think about something that's perhaps a bit bigger. So the first thing to do is, step 1 is to think about knowing your risks, understanding what risks you are. And that could be where you are, what you have, what you're doing, how complex is it. So understanding the risks is very important. So first of all, think about the big one, the site-wide disaster. Now, some companies I've worked with in the past, a very well-known animated film producer, one of their directives for site-wide disasters is they have to have data copied across tectonic plates. So they're in a whole different kind of geographical movement. So site-wide disasters, what are you going to do to get out of that? And do you need to have a plan? I've come across people that say, do you know what? If that happens, we'll just stop. There's no point going on. So that's another outcome, but probably not the desirable one. Platform failures, slightly smaller risk here, maybe slightly smaller impact. Something that is just literally a failure of one element inside your infrastructure, but has a knock-on effect. So understanding that is quite important, understanding the relationships that your technology has. Application issues, we're getting kind of narrower now. We're really getting kind of down to the nitty-gritty here of application issues. Was the recent patch you've just applied bad? Do you have to roll back? How do you do that? All these kind of nice things. And you can kind of use these elements to step towards having some form of control as well. I've worked with a finance company in London. They wouldn't do anything in terms of upgrades or changes without actually going through a whole range of controls to see if it met all their criteria before they actually did it. So that's understanding the risk associated with each change, or even just something as simple as data loss. That's all a risk to everybody right now. We talk about ransomware. One element of that is obviously the extortion of the data that they actually take out of your environment. The other one, of course, is that they actively start to encrypt things, and now they're going after backup solutions to try and delete data as well. They really want to leave you in a situation where you're dependent on them. So there's another risk we have to think about. So we've gone all the way from site-wide disasters, natural stuff, big things happening, all the way down to the minutiae of data loss, which might sound, fairly small when compared to a major disaster, but to your company, it's still a disaster if you're losing, amounts of data at that kind of lower level. So what can we do about this? In our step 1, first thing, perform a risk assessment. Inventory your assets. Sounds simple, right? Know what you have. There's an awful lot of people don't do this, and they just assume they know what they've got. And sometimes you find with things like VM sprawl and this kind of shadow IT, things people are bringing in that are unknown can go out the window. So inventory your assets, understand what you have, and if you can, automate that inventory gathering, that information as well. Get rid of all the gaps you might have. Humans tend to leave out things. Assess the threats that you might have, understand what you might be up against in terms of the natural disasters, as David was saying earlier about localized flooding. What's local to your area? There's a really good reason you find data centers placed in the middle of deserts in Nevada, for example. The threats are fairly low there. It doesn't change much in terms of weather. It's nothing adverse potentially going on, so you start to reduce the threats. So assess what you've got around you. Where are you? What can you not have in your environment that may cause you issues? Think about looking inside your data center and looking at the air conditioning and the pipes under the floor, and also understand the business of your neighbors as well. What are they doing that may well cause you problems? And then start thinking about analyzing the impact of each potential kind of incident or threat type. So what would happen to your assets if you had a natural disaster, as an earthquake? It's a fairly low probability in some geographical areas, a little bit higher in others perhaps. And what's the impact going to be? Fairly high? And you compare that to something as simple as just a power outage. It's got a higher probability than an earthquake, and the impact is still just as high. So where do you focus more on your attention straight away? Is, well, okay, I need to think about, is my power good? Because obviously that has a higher probability and also a high impact. So just by looking at some of the assets you have in the locations they're in, wherever your offices or data centers may be, think about what the potential risks are associated with that geographical location, or your neighbors doing things, or just generally the day-to-day stuff when things go wrong. What's it going to do? So perform a risk assessment. That's kind of step one. And then we go on to step two as well.
Yeah, Adrian, I'm curious here. You talked about having the data center in the desert to avoid, floods. So are you saying that different types of companies would have, in different locales, would have different types of risks that they need to consider?
Absolutely. Yeah. If you have a data center that's sitting in Florida, it has a different risk profile to a data center sitting in Arizona. So if you've got distributed data areas, that's good, because you can actually take advantage of that and move data, and take copies of data to the areas that have a reduced risk profile. So you can think of ways of actually mitigating against that, but every location is likely to be slightly different.
Yeah, that's a great point. One disaster recovery plan isn't going to fit every single data center in every single, geographic region, or even every single city. So great point there. And then I know I mentioned distributed data, and you talked about, data in the cloud. When you put
Mhm.
data in the cloud or in SaaS apps, do you have different sort of risk assessments that you need to perform with that?
It is slightly different with that risk assessment, because when you're using something like a SaaS app, it's a shared responsibility model. The provider of the SaaS solution is responsible for the service itself, keeping that running, keeping that available. But you're probably still responsible for the data. More often than not, I would say like 95% of the time, you are responsible for the data and its health. And just because it's being hosted somewhere else doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't take that into your risk assessment, because essentially, a SaaS application is running on something in a data center somewhere, and usually, hopefully, that SaaS provider or those service providers should be able to tell you how they mitigate against their risks and what their risk assessment is within that data center. So don't be shy about asking the SaaS provider that. They should have that information, and then you can add that into your own business risk profile as well.
Yeah, great point. I mean, there's that joke about the cloud is really someone else's data center, but you can't assume that that data center is bulletproof and covered. You need to protect yourself. So, great points. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's move on to step two. So, step two, knowing your data sounds simple enough. Do you really understand it? We all say, yes, I've got lots of virtual machines. Yes, I've got lots of files. Yes, I've got lots of databases. But how does that relate to your business? And don't forget, we're looking at risk here, and risk associated with business. So understanding where the important data is for your business is all part of the risk assessment, because that is going to be the key data you've got to look after and get back up and running. So this is where you can start to think about classifying the types of data you might have, understanding the systems and their interactions with each other, because you'll also have dependencies too. Things like web servers or a web farm might be dependent on a particular database, which is dependent on some storage, which is running on a particular platform. So you have a whole chain of dependency. But then also look at the data within it. What's important? You have normally you can put them into three buckets, right? So you've got static data. So this is data that doesn't change over time very much. Sometimes it's, we say, okay, I want to get rid of this and move this. This is kind of the prime stuff you might want to move out to cloud. You have to keep it for regulatory requirements. It doesn't change much over time. Is it really important to the business? Some of it might be. Do I use it every day? Probably not. So you think, okay, well, static data, is it really critical? Probably not. Then we move into the business vital stuff. This is the daily operations of the business. These are the things that users will interact with on a regular basis, day in, day out. Now, it might not be all the time, but they'll have some impact on it, and it is continuously changing. So this is the kind of stuff we start to get into now. That particular data set is important to the business. If it's not there, people are going to say, I either have to recreate it, or it's going to be an awful long time for me to actually get productive again because I have to rebuild things. It starts to become a bit more vital to the business. And then you get to kind of the top level stuff, the mission critical stuff to the business, the thing that your business cannot survive without. So, for example, if you're an online shopping company and you've got a website with a database behind it, I'll use that example again. It's a pretty good one. If the database dies, you can't take transactions. You can't take credit card transactions. You don't have that information anymore. The card number's gone. The CVV code's gone. All the other bits and pieces are gone. You can't bill that customer. So not only do you have an issue in terms of revenue not coming in, you've now got an upset customer. Oh, and by the way, when it's something with a wide front end that's available to the public will be tweeting about it potentially before you know you have a problem. So you have to be on your guard as well. The mission critical stuff may just have a reputation impact more than anything else. And so that can also be just as hard to recover from than just recovering the data itself. So you have to kind of look at the data you have, look at the systems you have, understand which ones are the most important, because when you're in a complete disaster recovery, you are going to want to know which ones you have to go and attack first to get back up and running. You're not going to sit there and start doing print servers and file servers. You are going to be doing databases and web farms because that's your business. So understanding what it is that you have, understanding the data, understand the important piece, understand its dependencies, and then start to think about the applications that you have within the business that people use. And this is where it starts to get interesting, when you get into the understanding the level of governance and operations around looking after all of this data. Because sometimes there are certain data that may be static. You just can't move anywhere else because you have a governance requirement. And sometimes the operations around the mission critical stuff, you can't always do what you want to do because you can't get the downtime to go and update it or patch it or whatever you have to do. So it's always a continuous game. You've got to balance this out. And then if we talk about that application criticality in that mission critical stuff, understand what it means to your business stakeholders, understand what it means to the people that are running your business, how important that is. Now, you do have to take their answer usually with a bit of salt. It's sometimes it's kind of like, if you ask them, how much data do you want me to protect? They'll always say all of it. Now, some of it might be static, some of it might be critical. It's down to you to work this out with those stakeholders. And once you get to that point, you can start to group your applications and data together. You can start to say, this application set and this data set, these are business vital, these are mission critical, these are static. And you start to be able to form a model around how your data sits and operates within your business. And that's quite a key one, is to get that done. And to also try not to make it too complex. simplify it to, the three groups that I said, static, business, vital, mission critical. If you think there's some gray areas between them, stick another couple of groups in there, but don't go too mad. Don't try and have these finite groups, because you'll end up with a list of all these groups, which is just aligning to all the servers that you have. I've seen that happen before. And you then think, well, how does that make any sense? Because there's all these dependencies, so I actually have to look at it at a high level. So look at this when you're thinking about recovering stuff. Think about how people use things. Think about their applications, the data, the importance, and the dependency. I know it's a big list, and this is why we have to start writing these things down. So here in this next slide is an example, an idea of how you can start to work these things out. It's a very simple idea. You just put down the location, as we talked about earlier. The location's quite important because you might have different risks in different locations. Understand the machinery, the virtual machines, the hosts, whatever it is. Understand what's underneath that then, what's running on those, what kind of operating systems are you going to have to deal with, what applications have you got, even your IP address ranges. If you've got lots of subnets and you've got complicated routing tables, you're going to want to know that stuff too. Data set sizes. So when you're recovering, you should know what kind of data sizes to expect on recovery, so you can work out how long, but also to make sure you've got everything back. It will give you a good indication. And then you have the dependencies. What's dependencies have you got? So the Microsoft 365, for example, there's a big dependency on Microsoft being operable. Without that, it doesn't work. So you have this big dependency there, and then they'll have their data centers and their regions and their failover and everything else. So you can just carefully break this down into different kind of threats, internal and external, again, across my data sets in my locations, and then work out what the classes are going to be. What are your impacts? How do you specify low, medium, and high? So you can write this out yourself. Or you can screenshot this one if you want to, but you can say, this is what I think is a low impact to the business. This is what I think is a high impact to the business. When you're looking at high impact, it's nothing's working, or in this particular, as an application set, this application is not working. So I could take this panel here and say, this is an application and I need all of these services with all of these systems, with all of this data. It's very, very important. It's a high impact. These are my risks. So now you start to build a model for each of your applications you might have within a business and understand exactly what you have. And of course, at the back end of all of this is all the data. So don't forget that too. You can have all the, everything up and running and databases talking to web farms and it's all happy. Without the data, it's pretty much useless to anybody. So that's a very important thing to remember, is that it's not just always about the systems. The data is possibly more important.
Yeah, great points, Adrian. I mean, you talk about knowing the data and knowing the apps. What I wanted to ask you here is, with so many applications today being more and more complex and interdependent on other apps, do you have any advice for someone who's building out a plan like this on how they can understand these kind of complex apps?
It's not an easy one. What I would say is use some technology. There are quite a few tools out there that enable you to actually look at dependency in this way. There are a few at Quest as well. So to try and understand the dependency, whether it's even just a network topology for a starting point, things talk to things. It's not an easy one to do, the dependency piece. You can have things that have kind of grown organically, things that, have been added. And this is where the change control thing really kind of works. If you put really good guardrails around change, your change control should be very, very strict so that you can keep a record of this. So once you start building this, it doesn't stop once you think you finish, because as soon as somebody wants to add something, change something, your plan, your inventory, your risk assessment, and your classification changes as well. So be ready for this to continue going forward as well. So it's an interesting one.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, disaster recovery just has to be built into the change management process, just like security and everything else that you do in the IT organization. That's a great way to think about it. And then when we talk about the data, there's a question here. Someone's asking about fail back. What do you do with the data sets when you fail back?
Well, that's a really interesting question. There is the failover and fail back. it's sometimes the one that everybody misses, because everybody says, oh, okay, here's my disaster recovery solution. And if they have to go and invoke that, they go and invoke that, they do everything, the big move, everything's up and running. And everybody goes, okay, well, it's now all running over there. What do I do now? Because all my data sets have changed and everything else. So again, you can look at different technologies that are either replicating data sets underneath. You can reverse the replication if you want to, depending on how your data is mapped out, how it's stored, how it's attached, and the applications and the way that they access it. So it's not an easy one to deliver. There are solutions out there that are designed to do just this kind of thing. But there's an interesting, easier spin on this. That company I mentioned that I've worked with over the years in London, they have this very strict change control process. And interestingly, what they did was that their main data center was not in their office. It was in actually a colo that was provided that they paid for. Their disaster recovery was in their office. They completely flipped the paradigm the other way, because they thought, well, if the colo has a disaster, which is designed not to by its very nature, it's got good power, lighting, cooling, and all that kind of stuff. If that fails, then your disaster recovery is in your office where all of your talent is. So instead of having 3 or 4 people trying to squeeze into a colo somewhere, you've got all of your team in your office with your disaster recovery data set. But also what they used to do, they used to flip between data centers as a test. And we're gonna talk about testing and planning a bit later. But they used to do this regularly, like every 6 months, they would flip between data centers to make sure it all worked. And that's how finite you can get if you have these great change control guides and these assessments, and everything's so organized that you should be able to do that. I wouldn't quite say at the flick of a switch, but it shouldn't be hard. And if you practice that, then you're going to be really kind of ready. But by flipping that paradigm, I thought was quite a cute way of doing it, was saying our disaster recovery location is actually in our office. So if it happens to a level 3 data center, well, we've seen that, we've actually got all the talent next to all the data, which is really a key thing when you're doing this kind of recovery.
Excellent. Yeah, good points. And then what about executive sponsorship at this stage? Do they need to be ready to help you out with the prioritization of these critical apps?
They do, and they need to understand the risks as well, right? They need to be able to understand the risks and the impact on the business. When you start showing them an impact on the business, especially in terms of revenue, they'll start to understand that. They'll start to get that. And you say, look, this isn't going to come for free. If you want to have this kind of outcome with the business, then there's a cost associated with it. And hopefully the cost is less than the business is worth. So, you've got to balance that too. But if you start showing them, the potential revenue loss that they could do, and we're going to get to that bit a little bit later as well, then it starts to get those kind of executive leaders thinking a bit more and understanding about the problems a bit more, and actually giving you a bit more space, a bit more leeway to get this done. If you can get executive sponsorship in that way to understand potential impacts to the business and revenue loss and reputational loss as well, just as important, then they start to get a buy-in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you're going to have executives help you to set kind of the RPOs and RTOs as well
Yep.
um, to be able to select the right investment level to support those. So let's talk about the goals.
All right. So step 3, as you say, let's talk about the goals. So know your goals, know what you're trying to achieve. Don't try and boil the ocean. It's going to be too hard. You need to have a staged plan for recovery. You need to understand how you're going to do this. So this is where we get to that kind of, that piece around executive sponsorship and setting some understandings in the business. This is the one that nobody likes, right? How much downtime can you tolerate? You're going to have some. It's going to happen at some point. Nothing runs forever. You're going to have a problem at some point. So you have to understand how much downtime can you tolerate. And this is where, if you thought about segregating your data sets, you can actually apply different downtimes for different data sets. And you've already mentioned kind of the recovery time objective, which is the kind of important one. And you could actually, if you wanted to, protect your data sets in different ways to give you different outcomes based on the criticality of the data. You give that a better RPO, which means you run the risk of losing less data, and you give it a better RTO as well, so you can recover it quicker. So downtime, how much can you tolerate? Now, we've seen the millions of dollars per hour that you could get into, $9 million an hour. That's a lot of cash. I did have some statistics a long time ago about, if you worked out an outage of Amazon for an hour, it was into the billions. It was an enormous sum. So that's one thing. How much downtime can you tolerate? How much data can you afford to lose? You are going to lose some. You can't back up everything. You can't keep everything. As much as all of those stakeholders will say, I want you to back up everything, you say, well, the bucket of money you give me isn't big enough to do that. So we have to be smarter about what we back up and what we protect and how we do that. So you're going to lose some. There are going to be gaps in between pulling your data out between backups. Now, lots of people say to me, oh, what about replication? Because if I do replication, then I've got everything. Well, yes and no. Replication is good and it forms part of the solution. But if you delete from side A, you delete from side B in replication. So it's literally just a copy of what you have at that point in time. Sounds familiar? Sounds a bit like a backup. But it has the ability to lose data as much as it does, hold data. So it forms part of that, and we'll see where that slots in a little bit later. How long do you need to retain the data for? This is a big question specifically around backup. I mean, we have huge amounts of data sets these days to deal with, and we've got to get them into the same amount of time. Time's a constant. So we have to be able to have technology that squashes it all down and allows us to move it very, very efficiently. Because if you think about, protecting data in that respect, you are trying to move all of your business's data from point A to point B as fast as physics will allow. So when you think about, okay, I can't keep everything, I have to think about this. At some point, you've got to say, I've got to let go of some of this data. I can't hoard it forever. And this is where you start talking about retention periods in your backup. It's how much can I hold? Now, you might want to hold more and more and more, and you look for technologies like deduplication help you do that. And it helps you to store more data for longer. That's essentially what deduplication is going to give you as an outcome. But do you need to? Do you need to retain it forever? There might be some stuff that you do, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years if it's legal or financial stuff. Here in the UK, our National Health Service has to keep patient record information for the lifetime of the patient. And, that could be another 20, 30 years. And some instances, there'll be data that, will still be around an awful long time into the future. So, I don't know how we're going to get to there, but I probably won't be around when that problem occurs. But it's a question of, understanding your data again. How long do you need to keep it? Where do you store your protected data? So where you're storing your backups is just as important as as all the understanding piece. If you've got a compromised data center that's high risk, you really don't want to be storing your backup in the same place. It's not a good idea. And over the years, I've seen people with, the big tape libraries, we used to have lots of those. They would take the tapes out, put them in a box, and it's in the same data center, in the same room. If you have a fire, it's all gone. And then we got to, taking them off site, and it's a bit of a chore. But, it's good to have it somewhere else. And it's good to have more than one copy of it. And again, while we have lots of data, we have to look at technology that enables us to do that efficiently as well. So just as important to think about that, where you store your protected data. We go back to the example of having those distributed data centers. You could pick one that has a very low risk, and that's where I'm going to store my backup data or a copy of it, because I know it's low risk. I'm not going to lose that as well. At the end of the day, backup is your get out of jail free card. It's a reactive technology. It cures a symptom. It's not something that's preventative to a point. You only really need it when you want to use it. So it's kind of a halfway house. So when we can think about this piece, when we get to storing protected data, What about your backup objectives? How do you classify this? What is your recovery time objective? Recovery point objective. um, GRO, that's an interesting one. So geographical recovery objective. Do you have to do all of this somewhere else that's halfway across the country that it's going to take you a few hours to get to? That is going to impact on your recovery time. Any kind of travel, any kind of I have to get boots on the ground, it's going to add that time in. And lots of people used to say, oh, recovery time objective, yes, that's an hour or 20 minutes, whatever. But they didn't count the fact that it took 4 hours for the guy in the van to bring the tapes back to site, and then it took me 3 hours to recover the data set, and then it took me another 2 hours to actually get the data set working. That's, of course, if I've got the right tapes. That's, of course, if I can read them all. So it's fraught with all these kind of things. So really start to define what you really understand as being the true recovery time objective. Really think about where the data is going to come from for you to be able to make it productive. And that's the key thing here. Not just, I've got it back onto a disk. It should be, it's back and it's being used and changed in production by your users. They have access. They're working again. That's the full recovery time objective. So what is it going to be? Is it going to be what everybody talks about? Oh, we can recover things in minutes or seconds. Great. Is it really that? Or is it a couple of hours on after you've checked that everything's okay and you allow users back on again? So kind of consider that too. So start classifying across that data sets again. So static, business vital, mission critical. Which ones do you need back first? Which ones can you get back quickly? Which ones are in that risk assessment that's high, that you need to think, actually, they're in a high risk area, it's mission critical data, I need to have a really good, quite solid backup solution set that's going to give me something that I can recover with. And you might actually think, I may not actually be able to recover back to that location because it's got this high risk area. I'm going to have to plan in my plan to actually recover it somewhere else, another geographical location, because that's going to be less risk, and potentially the one where it's come from is completely wiped out. So you have to take all these little bits and all these nuances into account of, how long is it going to be? What is it? Is it mission critical? Is it business vital? And where am I going to do it to? And how am I going to get access to that? And how are my users going to get access to that? I've had plenty of instances where people are saying, we've done our disaster recovery and everybody's sat back and none of the users can access it because nobody thought to give them access to the network. So it's just everything you've got to think about and step through. And then if you think about you kind of map this recovery process as well. So what is it that you want to get to? So here's a frequency of retention site, main sites, you've got hourly, business continuity sites, maybe daily, disaster recovery stuff, nearline weekly, and monthly stuff is like the disaster recovery, the real offline, the static data, the stuff you might even think about putting out into cloud. So we kind of do this as a timeline. You start the clock ticking. You've got application data and operating systems. You've protected them at 10 past 12. That's your backup point. And right after then, perhaps you have a problem, a disaster strikes. You effectively have application outages and you have data loss. So in between 12:10 and 12:15, you have potential to have lost data, the data that has changed since your last backup. As I said, you are likely to suffer data loss throughout this kind of process. This is where it happens. So you've got to think about restoring, recovering, and restarting. Now, understanding having something that has recovery point objectives of every 5 minutes or every 15 minutes, they come with a price tag. You're going to be storing lots of data to keep all of that in place, especially if you've got a large amount of data you want to do that too. It gets exponentially more expensive the closer you get to zero on that recovery point objective, to the point you get to doing things like storage-based replication, which means your primary production storage you buy two of, and that's not cheap. So think about that too. So restoring, recover, and restarting. You're going to have to restart potentially an operating system or a virtual machine. You've got to spin that up. Can you instant boot it directly from storage and do a vStorage motion and bring it into production? All those lovely things that technology is providing us these days. So as I go through this whole thing, that I've recovered my operating system effectively, which could be my virtual machine. I've recovered my data set because maybe the disaster's made the current one corrupted. I don't know. You need to check that too. So you recover the data back. You've made that available. So as soon as you've made that available, the gap between disaster and data availability is my application downtime. That's when my users are not working. And that's the bit that you have to understand, is from disaster to being available again. That is your true recovery time objective.
Adrian, this is really excellent. Great steps here, great advice. I'm afraid we've only got about 15 minutes left here in the event, so I'm going to not ask any more questions until you get to the end here, because I want to make sure we have plenty of time to learn about, the Quest solution and get through all the 7 steps. So forge ahead.
Right. Okay. I'm going to forge ahead. I'm going to move this through quickly now. We're getting to step 4. So knowing your tools. Now, this is something you should be kind of really up to scratch with. You should know what you have in your toolbox to get these things done. So you should understand your capabilities. You've got file and folder based recovery, application aware recovery. When we're looking at things like SQL databases, you can actually put them back as SQL databases. Machine image based snapshot recovery. We've all been into that for quite some time with virtual machines, and also physical machines. You can do the same kind of thing. Deduplication retention, how you store your data, can you replicate it, how much do I store? These tools and technologies are going to help you as well. Single item recovery, high-speed machine recovery. Small disaster might be for somebody in your organization losing, 1 or 2 very critical emails. To you, it's not a big disaster. To them, it's everything. So you might be just saying, I'm going to avert your personal disaster and here's your email back. Or, you're looking at recovering a whole machine back very, very quickly. So understanding some tools and technologies inside there as well. Cloud data usage, time to recovery. How do you get cloud data back? How do you put data back up into cloud if it's been lost? Has it been replicated to different regions? All these kind of things you have to think about if you're into cloud and using that, and how long it takes you to get those services pointing to those data sets that might have been replicated somewhere else. Think about the impact if you're running that solution, which requires a lot of DevOps, how they're going to do that too. So again, think about that. And then think about all of these capabilities you might have, and think about them, it's like a defense in depth here. So you can use storage snapshots or asynchronous replication. This is happening on your primary data storage. This is your production storage. It's expensive because you normally have to buy 2 of them. And then, okay, I'm going to tier the data off effectively now. So this is where your backup solution comes in. It's a form of tiering the data off done at a particular point in time. So that gives me my backup copies. But of course, we like to have more than one of those offsite. Best practices to do that, and potentially a tertiary one as well. So we're going to say, okay, I'll replicate one somewhere else. And now I want an offsite copy that's outside of my company organization environment. In other words, not in any of my data centers. Maybe I'll use cloud, or potentially I can write that out to tapes, and then they can go off to somewhere like Iron Mountain. So you have a whole set of defense here, depending on what you want to recover and how you need to recover quickly. Replication is really good if you want to recover and get access to large amounts of bulk data very, very quickly. It's there and it's pretty much up to date. Local backups are going to be looking at data sets that may well have been accidentally removed, maliciously removed, encrypted, corrupted, all manner of things. That's when you're going to go back to your local backup. And the offsite stuff is going to be really good if your backup has been compromised in any way on premise. You've got your data set somewhere else that is actually under lock and key. So again, build these defenses in depth as you go forward. Step 5, build an offsite plan. And this sounds a bit odd because most of us have been offsite for quite a while now. Seems a bit odd. But have you still had data centers running? If you have, then those data centers have still been at risk. So again, you still got to think about that. You may be offsite now, but your data center hasn't moved anywhere. So you still have to cope with all of those things. So second sites, do I have them cold? Do I have them warm? Do I have them hot? Well, it's all going to depend on how you want to recover things. Are you looking at offsite tape storage? That's very, very cold. Failover and load balancing. We get into kind of warm and hot kind of stuff here now. Comes with a cost associated with it because it's always running. Duplicate the primary. Do you want exactly the same thing in your primary data center into your disaster recovery? That's really expensive. But hey, guess what? You can get that recovery time down really, really quickly, especially if you're replicating all your storage, your data, your virtual machines, your applications. If you're doing everything, great. But it comes at a price. So this is where people think, do I scale down? Do I scale down just to deal with the mission critical stuff because that's the business? So maybe that's what you have to do. You make sacrifices at this point, get those bits running while you go and sort out the rest of it. And then we've got cloud, disaster recovery as a service, virtual standby options. Cloud is becoming quite a nice, usable element where you don't have to pay for the data center. You don't have to pay for things that are running. But if you can actually creep the data up there and leave it kind of static and ready to go, it costs you a little bit more, but it's probably an awful lot less than having a full-on data center with everything running and replicating everything all the time. But it's going to be potentially slower in terms of recovery. Just depends on how you deploy it and use it. So when you get into this, it's interesting where data readiness is not just about retention of saying, I've got all my backups from the last 5 years. It doesn't really matter. The likelihood is you're going to be recovering from the most recent one because that's the data that everybody's going to want. So you've got to think about the things, the places you've got to be able to recover it to. So your recovery agility has to be pretty high. So identical hardware, dissimilar hardware, are you doing bare metal restores, virtual machines, are you putting things to the cloud, are you having to pull things out of cloud? How are you going to deliver this? Think about how agile your recovery's got to do, how some of your data sets, applications, and machines may have to translate their entire infrastructure, moving from what's basically a hardware server into a virtual machine. Yes, you can do that, but how well is it going to perform? That goes back to what about the recovering back again? How do I get my virtual machine back to a physical server again to make it perform properly for my business? So that's another thing you have to think about. And some backup solutions, and we have a few at Quest, can actually enable that kind of recovery agility. And this is where you get that really kind of agile stuff, the mission critical stuff. You want to be quick, fast, simple, and retain that kind of up-to-date data set quickly. And that usually does come at a cost because you're collecting quite a bit more data than you would normally plan to. So step 6, document your plan. Don't keep it in your head because tomorrow you might be under a bus. It sounds a bit harsh, but it's the way things are. So document it. Allow others to look at it. Allow your stakeholders to read it. Allow your executive team to read, absorb, and understand. Very important that when you're having to go through this kind of stuff, you don't want them on the phone to you every 5 minutes saying, is it up yet? Is it up yet? Is it up yet? Because they're just going to burn your time. So document it. So involve the stakeholders across the business. Clearly outline your service level agreements back to the business. This is how long it's going to take in case of failures. Detail what to do before you need to do it. So make sure you have everything written down so I go to here, I do this, I flick this switch, press these buttons, and this comes online and it provides X to the business. Detail what the outcome is. And keep doing this because, as we say, a plan is nothing, planning is everything. You are going to be continuously planning every time you make a change, every time you do an update. Do I go and update all my ESX servers? What's my risk? Have you associated a risk that the new version may have a problem? Everybody likes to do the new things. That's great, but understand it. Make it part of your plan. Make it part of your change control. Add it all in together. And then if we kind of timeline this as well, recovery time versus exposure. And if you don't have a plan, it's going to cost you more money, that outage, because you're going to be floundering around, not knowing what to do. Which bit do I attack first? Which bit's more important to the business? Your phone's going to be ringing off the hook. You're not going to be able to achieve what you want to achieve. If I start to make plans, I start to reduce the impact of that. I start to make things happen quicker if I need to. It starts to reduce the financial exposure. The quicker you do things, the cheaper it gets to the business. The more you plan, the quicker you can do this kind of stuff. And as I get more and more into this, I start getting myself now to an acceptable cost of downtime, an acceptable outage. So the more and more I plan, the better I make this, the quicker I can recover, the better it's going to be for the business. So, step 7. We've actually had a question from Paul about how often should a business test run the disaster recovery readiness plan? What are the most critical aspects to test for? Well, here we are. Challenge your plan. Test your defenses in layers. Now you can do walkthrough exercises, tabletop exercises, component exercises. I used to have a boss that would walk into the data center and just pull a cable out of a network socket. And then we had to work out what was going on because he hadn't told us. But it's good. It's a good thing to do. If you knew exactly what to go and do in that kind of outage, you would recognize that's gone offline. This has got a problem. That's not talking to that. Is it a network issue? Let's go and check that out. You go and find it because you understand what you have. Full-scale simulations, yeah, they're tougher. Now you need to be really good at your change control. You really need to have everything together. You really need to have that kind of nailed. If you want to get to the full-scale simulation, I suggest when you're starting to learn this stuff, do it in isolation. Do small pockets, bits and pieces at a time as you go forward. So hopefully that kind of helps you, Phil. It's how often do you do it? It's kind of up to your business, really, and how well you've actually implemented the plan and how well you've kind of got it kind of nailed. But start small and say, I can do that bit, and then I can do this bit, and I can do this bit, and you start to build that out, and it gets bigger and becomes more of a plan. And your plan is alive. It's a living thing. All I say is test, and then test again. Without testing it, you don't know whether the plan is going to work or not. So you have to test to some element. Automate the testing to add some coverage. If you haven't got enough people, find solutions that help you automate this kind of thing. Build back up into the IT planning cycle. I cannot stress this enough. So many times I've heard people say, we've deployed this, we've got a problem with the backup now because this new technology, we can't back it up. And it's already in production, it's already got live data on it, you're already exposing the business. So one of the key things here is reduce the risk and exposure to the business. Add the backup into the IT planning cycle, add it into change control. If you can't back it up, you shouldn't be putting it into production because you're putting your company at risk. So the last couple of minutes, I'm going to whiz through. We have a solution set at Quest. There's actually quite a few solutions we have around this, but I'm going to walk you through one that's actually quite expansive in what it can do in terms of technology. And this solution is something we call NetVault Plus. Now, what NetVault Plus is, it's a backup and recovery solution that integrates deduplication technology and works directly within the backup application itself. So we can look at data centers with physical and virtual servers. We apply a backup server. It's fairly standard stuff. And then as part of the NetVault Plus suite, you get a technology called Core Store, which is a software-defined deduplication technology that you can run pretty much on anything, or in a virtual machine, or in cloud. So it's very, very agile. So that agile world is cropping up here. It's very important. We can take data sets. We'll provide source-side deduplication, writing that data directly into actually storage, so you don't need all the media servers. It goes directly from the client data sets directly into the backup storage. That's great. We've done our backup stuff, but we like to have that second copy somewhere else. So with this technology, we can actually actively replicate the backup solution sets that are optimized as well and securely. That secure connect technology we use between the sites here, it's got a 4096-bit RSA key. It's super secure. Encryption at rest as well is really good. So if people want to come and steal your stuff, they take away the whole physical box or a virtual machine, they're not going to be able to read the content. And then again, if you want to actually move older data out to cloud, so around that kind of regulatory stuff, putting it into colder storage, NetVault Plus aligned with Core Store allows you to move data sets out to Glacier or Deep Glacier, or if you want them a little bit quicker, then you can maybe put them out to somewhere like Wasabi or Google Cloud or IBM Cloud or Azure. Lots of choices to actually utilize data sets. Now, this is transparent. So if you do need to recover it, the data set comes from the Core Store, main dedupe store first, then fills in blocks afterwards, reduces the egress costs, speeding first time to byte recovery as well, getting that data set back as soon as possible. So very, very important. Now, what about cloud stuff? Well, you can actually run NetVault out in cloud. You can run it in your cloud tenant with your virtual machines in exactly the same way. You can back those up. You can run Core Store in cloud as well. In fact, the latest version makes the use of object storage at the back end the cheapest possible cloud storage you can use. So yes, it is deduplicating cloud storage for you. So again, source-side deduplication, even in that cloud tenant or even across cloud tenants if you so wish. We can replicate somewhere else. So if you want to be fully cloud, you could replicate it to a different region somewhere else, all deduplicated, all compressed, all encrypted. And again, you still have those options to go and tier data out to another cloud provider for long-term retention or whatever you want to do. So the whole solution actually comes together, whether you're in on premises, whether you have a cloud tenant, whether you're hybrid, and it has all the elements to actually get your data out to the cloud providers as well. Broad coverage on operating systems, then the application set as well. Microsoft 365 is super capable with that kind of technology, multiple streaming, high speed stuff, deduplicated at source coming out. Teams as well, big one at the moment, lots of data in Teams. People go, I'm not quite sure what to do with it. Well, we'll help out with that too. And then we get into the kind of the more general stuff you start to see in the enterprises, the SQL Service, the Oracles, SAP HANA, and also some kind of outliers as well. It's very, we do Linux extremely well. So we get into things like MariaDB and MySQL and Postgre as well. And, cloud databases, MongoDB Atlas, we're going to cover that too. So that's possibly the fastest I think I've ever delivered that solution outcome, just to get it in on time for us. So if you want more information about that, you can actually visit quest.com/solutions/disaster recovery. If you want to learn more about NetVault Plus, you can do quest.com/NetVault-Plus, and we'll get you there as well. So hopefully now we're going to get round to the last little slide for you, David, to talk about the bit that everybody wants to hear.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great presentation. I really enjoyed that. I learned a lot. I love the 7 steps here. Before I announce the gift card, of course, I want to make sure I leave up this URL for everyone as long as possible. That URL there is a clickable link. If you just click on it, that'll take you to quest.com/solutions disaster recovery. Also, don't forget about the handouts tab there. It's there that you'll find links to enhancing your disaster recovery strategy with CoreStore and the NetVault Plus Enterprise Data Protection solution that Adrian just taught us about. So again, great presentation, such valuable advice here in these 7 steps for disaster recovery readiness. I'm afraid we've run out of time for our live Q&A session. We'll have to get back to the folks who ask questions electronically, but we do appreciate all the great questions and, of course, the valuable information. Adrian, thank you so much for being on the event today.
It's been an absolute pleasure as always. Thank you for having me, David.
And thank you to Quest for supporting the event. I'll leave up the URL there for everyone to check out while I announce the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card door prize. This is going out to Eric Daniel from Pennsylvania. Congratulations, Eric Daniel from Pennsylvania. I hope everyone learned a lot on the event today. Make sure that you are really protected for disaster, because I'm afraid it's just a matter of time before our company's data is impacted in one way or another. And like we said, there's multiple ways that you can be impacted by disaster. So make sure that you're ready. Have a great day. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.